Well, in our course on biology, we've completed an important section of this course, which is to see how life is built up from atoms up into cells. So it's a good stopping point to take a look at some of the processes that are important to all of life, especially life at the molecular level. And so I'm going to be talking today about a topic which might sound scary: thermodynamics. Thermodynamics makes life happen. It's an important concept to realize that thermodynamics, which is a branch of understanding how temperature, energy, molecular processes all work together, is what underpins all of the workings inside of a cell. Thermodynamics is the study of how physics and chemistry interplay with things at a very small level, and it tells us which way those physical and chemical processes will go. Will they move this way or will they move that way? Will things become other things or will those other things become the original things on their own or with a little bit of help? So life's driving force is often the flow of those ions across membranes. That was what was powering a lot of life. Physiochemical processes like that one are what thermodynamics inside the cell is all about. And one of the most important equations for understanding this type of thermodynamic process has the following letters: the letter G, the letter H, the letter T, and the letter S. Each of those four letters means something. And the way that the equation is structured, it has the G equaling the H minus the T times the S. Okay? Now the G is maybe the most important letter of this big equation because it's what the other three have to equal. And that G stands for Gibbs free energy. And Gibbs free energy tells which way a process goes. So if the Gibbs free energy is above zero, the change in that Gibbs free energy is above zero, it means that was not a good process. If the Gibbs energy is below zero, that's a good process because things are moving kind of downhill. Now, in order to know whether it's above or below zero, you have to know the H, the T, and the S. H is, you can think of standing for heat. It's really the enthalpy, but it stands in your mind. You can think of it as heat. And the S stands for entropy, which is how sloppy everything is. You can imagine the S standing for sloppy. The T, of course, stands for temperature. So if you take the sloppiness factor, multiply it by the temperature of life, which is 37 degrees Celsius or 96 degrees Fahrenheit, 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on what organism we're talking about. Those temperatures times the sloppiness entropy factor have to kind of fight against the heat factor. What do I mean by that? I mean that if the heat is going up, increasing the amount of heat, releasing heat into the environment, exothermically it's called, that's a good thing. That's a favorable thing. And if the sloppiness factor is getting more sloppy, that's also a good thing. That's the way that the universe always goes. Everything goes to more sloppy. So if things are releasing heat and things are getting more sloppy, the two are working together to make G very favorable, very much below zero. Okay? But if heat is not being released, it's being absorbed, okay? Or sloppiness is going the wrong way, it's becoming less sloppy, those are fighting against G, and G is going to become positive. Now what happens if heat is being released but sloppiness is becoming less? Well, heat can overwhelm the sloppiness factor, and then Gibbs free energy can still be below zero. And that's what happens a lot inside of the cell. The cell organizes things very uniquely, very perfectly, and so it's not surprising that the sloppiness factor, the entropy, is actually going to less sloppy. So delta H, or heat, the enthalpy, has to be released in order to cover that. And that's kind of the essentials of thermodynamics inside of the cell. There are other aspects of thermodynamics as well. For example, how osmosis can move water across membranes, how diffusion, which we've been kind of hinting at as we talked about proteins touching every other protein, giving each other high fives every second, those aspects too are controlled by the thermodynamic processes and can be understood through the study of thermodynamics. But that equation with the G's, the H's, the T's, and the S, I think that one's the most important. What about a little thought experiment right now? What would be required for life to just spontaneously happen? Of course, you'd need DNA, you'd need protein, you need some lipid membrane, you might want to throw in some polysaccharides for good measure. Well, what if we just took a good living cell or a system of cells and stuck them in the blender? Wouldn't we have all of the required components at that point? Yes, we would. We would have everything that was in life. It would still be right there. So if we put life in the blender and set it on the table, would we expect life to come out of that? Would we expect the little jar of soup that we pour out of the blender sitting on the table for a few minutes to spontaneously come back together? No, we would not. Just in the same way that if we drop an egg and it breaks, we would never expect, if we shook the floor, for the egg to come back and be right back together. Now, Newton's laws, the laws of physics, all the laws of motion, do not tell us why cracking an egg is easier than uncracking, putting the egg back together. Why Humpty Dumpty can fall apart, but all the king's horses can't put them back together. Newton's laws don't tell us that. Only thermodynamics, with its sloppiness factor, the S, can tell us why that happens. The laws of thermodynamics say that S in the universe is always increasing, and that's the direction that time's arrow goes. If you watch a video and see an egg crack, you know that it's going forward. If you see that same cracked up egg suddenly reform on some commercial or something, you know that they've run the clock backwards or they've done some fancy computer animation. Okay, so thermodynamics tells us which way things go using that delta G, the G that we learned about in the equation. It also tells us which way the arrow of time is pointing. And for life, there are very few ways to put together all of the components to keep it alive. And that's why it's so difficult to put something in a blender and hope that it would spontaneously form. Just like there are so few ways to put together the egg. And it's the number of ways that directly feeds into how big that S, sloppiness, entropy factor is. If there are few ways to put it together, S is small. If there are many ways, like cracking an egg, you can imagine there are many different ways to crack that egg, S is big. And so that helps you understand that equation and how S can go from small, which is not sloppy, to big, which is sloppy. The last thing I want to do is just tell a little story about civilization in an earthquake. I often like to think of the cell as a place, a civilization, where there's constantly an earthquake going on or a hurricane force wind. So I am going to imagine what it would take to drive, and you can do this too, drive a car in an earthquake-prone civilization. Would I need a motor? Well, it turns out that all I would have to do is wait for the right kind of seismic activity to push my car forward. I wouldn't need a motor, okay? But what I would need is I would need something that worked like a ratchet. So when the seismic activity pushed me forward and another seismic activity tried to push me back, I would be able to grab on with my ratchet and not go backwards. Okay? That is how it is inside of the cell. Things can move from one end of the cell to another in a very step-by-step fashion without any energy actually pushing it. The only energy that needs to be spent is to hold on when the forces of water bouncing around push it backwards. Okay? And that's happening all of the time. Inside of the cell, it is like a little hurricane, a little very intense earthquake that's always going on because there are constantly water molecules bombarding every little thing that's inside of the cell. And those water molecules are huge compared to the things inside. And they move with a huge amount of force. And so that's what it's like inside of the cell. If you're doing a little extra reading, you might want to examine the following leaves. What are physicochemical processes that are essential for life? That's a branch with a bunch of leaves under it. And where do cells get the energy they need to maintain life?